On behalf of the Hodgson family, both here and abroad, we would like to thank everybody for coming today, taking the time out of your weekends to come celebrate and remember the life of Dr. Ernest Hodgson, or as most of you know him, Ernie. So, you're going to hear from some speakers. I'm going to speak, my brother-in-law is going to speak, and then I'm going to turn it over to Clyde Sorensen, who has graciously decided to MC the event and keep the speakers going. Thanks to him for doing that. So I will hand it over to Rob in just a minute. A lot of his colleagues will tell you, and I'm sure you'll find out more about all of the achievements he did. He was very passionate about his work and helping the people of North Carolina through what he did. And for that, I'm extremely proud of him. But he was also a great dad. And so I have a lot of great memories with him. It was hard to pick one out, but I'm going to try and relay one as good as I can. Before I do that, I would also like to thank my coworker, who last week probably knew I needed a good laugh and was invited to this. I'm not sure he's here or not, but I won't out you if you are. Came up to me in the hall, gave his condolences, and then said, "So, I read your dad's bio, and I have one question for you. What the hell happened to you?" And fair point. I didn't really have an answer for that. So thanks. Thanks for doing that. So one of the fondest memories that my dad and I got to share was when we would go to the beach for vacation every year. Because there were 6 of us, me, my dad, and my mom, and 3 sisters. So we did all the normal beach stuff, everything like that. But after that, once he taught me to fish, we would go out on the pier flounder fishing about 10, 11 o'clock at night and fish till the sun came up, which was great when you were 8, 9 years old. I got to stay up all night, I got to hang out with my dad, just the 2 of us. It was awesome. But when he taught me to fish was not so awesome for me, because anyone who used to go to Atlantic Beach, Highway 70 was the only way to get there, and the new sports shop was the halfway point. So I was really excited when he bought me a brand new fishing rod on the way down there. I think I was 7 or 8. So we go down there and get settled, and this was during the day. He taught me how to bait the hook, he taught me how to set the hook, he taught me how to cast the hook, which apparently I wasn't paying attention for that part. So I get all ready, I'm all excited, impress my dad. Cast under the pier, holding the line like you should. I've let the spool go. Unfortunately, instead of letting go of the line, I let go of the entire fishing pole. So that was about the longest 10 seconds of my life up to that point. So a couple things happened. One, I start bawling immediately, of course, as my rod is flying end over end into the Atlantic Ocean. My dad utters a few colorful phrases, which I probably can't mention here, except for hell's teeth. I'm sure some of his colleagues will recognize that one. That was one of his go-to cuss words. So I heard that under his breath. But the first thing he did was comfort me and let me know didn't do anything wrong. It was an accident. I thought I was grounded for life, of course, because I'd just thrown away one of, but anyway, that's the kind of guy he was. He wasn't worried about the fishing rod, which we could all clearly see at the bottom of the ocean because it was really in 5 feet of water, so it was fine. And then I got to watch my dad fish for my fishing pole for the next 30 minutes or so, which was also fun. But anyway, he was a great man. He was a great father. And I'm glad y'all get to share and find out a little more about him today. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to my brother-in-law, Rob.
As Ernie's first, though not oldest son-in-law, I am in some ways the Jared Kushner of the Hodgson administration. To push this unfortunate analogy even further, I frequently felt like a fraud, believing that the generous welcome I received into this family was somehow undeserved. My relationship with Ernie developed gradually. Early on, Beth and I used to bring our laundry over and hang out on Sunday afternoons. While in college, I was allowed some storage space in the basement over summer break. One Sunday afternoon, he asked in my hearing when that guy was going to come and get his canoe out of the basement. However, eventually I became an official member of the family. I was generously allotted a room in the Hodgson compound to use as my woodworking shop. Ernie had done some woodworking in his younger days and frequently stopped in to check on my progress. He seemed especially impressed, if that's the correct word, with the amount of sanding I would do on my projects. He once told me he was concerned that I was going to sand that dining room table down into a coffee table. This was repeated with variations over the years, such as, you're going to sand that blanket chest down into a cigar box, etc., etc., etc. Eventually I was given, or rather inherited, the job of the assistant to the editor for the Journal of Biochemical and Molecular Toxicology, a publication of Hodgson Cottage Industries. I have a copy here. We're selling them in the lobby afterwards. It's a testament to our close relationship that I could read his handwritten directions. Some people in this room might relate to this. It is a skill only one step short of telepathy. Ernie had an odd, though endearing combination, as we all know, of withering sarcasm coupled with self-effacing humility. An alumnus of NC State University myself, I believe this is not actually caused by being a Wolfpack fan, but it is certainly compatible with it. His personal Wolfpack cheer was, "Our best is none too good." A frequent lament, the Wolfpack has once again snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. This was especially bitter when the opponent was less than formidable, or as he would say, the faculty wives. Ernie was not all there during the last few months of his life, but occasionally we would see glimpses of his old self. Always independent, he bristled at having round-the-clock care and referred to one of his aides as the sergeant. I'm afraid that some of his colleagues got an overly positive view of his condition because he was always at his best when talking with a visitor about his work. Thank you all for coming. We'll all miss Ernie in our own way. I hope that this gathering and sharing of our stories will help all of our hearts to heal. I know that healing is what this brilliant, generous, and loving man would wish for all of us. Thank you.
Well, can everybody hear me? By the way, I have to apologize to the family. The fact that he started losing his hearing later on, it's largely due to the fact that he sat in front of me at the basketball games. I'll be primarily responsible for introducing the rest of the speakers, but I would like to say real quickly that Ernie was very, very dear to me as well. My first introduction to Dr. Hodgson was as a portrait on the side of the conference room in the entomology department. And that portrait was of a very stern visage, piercing eyes. He was actually the acting department head when I was a graduate student for a time. And quite frankly, he terrified all of us. We were very, very intimidated by him. And then I finally managed to finish matriculating, and I wandered off out west for several years, and I got to come back and join the faculty at NC State again in 1996, and became reacquainted with Ernie. And I did not know how to approach him, quite frankly. I was still intimidated by his intellect and, quite frankly, by that stare he had. And this is a testament to the kind of guy he was. He was the fella who initiated our friendship. He was the guy who walked over while we were standing on the beach fishing and struck up the conversation with me. And of course it almost invariably involved several, generally would be considered tasteless jokes. He was a pretty big repository of those. So I was intimidated by this stern visage, but what I ended up coming to know was a very kind, very funny, very generous man. Another indication of his generosity was whenever we had poker at my house, he always made sure that my wife was a connoisseur of good scotch but cannot afford good scotch. Always got some of his good scotch. That was the first order of business whenever Ernie came to the house. So I'm going to miss him tremendously as well. He's a really fine fella, and as you all well know, somebody who left a huge impact on this place. All right, so our next speaker is Richard Mailman. Richard is a former student of Ernie's. He's on the faculty in the pharmacology department at Penn State, and so I'll turn it over to him.
Well, it's really nice to be here. When I said I would come, I didn't realize I was going to have to speak, so I have absolutely nothing prepared. But I have lots of stories about Ernie I can tell. The first time I met Ernie, actually, was really the moment that shaped my career, because I'd come to NC State to work for another faculty member, had decided to switch labs, and that other faculty member didn't want me to do that and went out of their way to actually get me expelled from the graduate school, despite the fact that I had a near 4.0 average and other good credentials. And I was really quite desperate, because I realized that this was my only chance. No other school would accept me if I'd been expelled from NC State. I just happened to see an ad in Science for a training program in molecular toxicology, and I went to see Frank Guthrie, whose many pictures you've seen up here, and Frank referred me to Ernie, and I think Ernie and I hit it off right away. And he basically said, "Oh, I know those people who got you kicked out. Don't worry, we'll take care of them." and he did. He gave me advice on how to do things, and I started in his lab, and it was a really wonderful experience. Dick Philpott, who you'll hear from later, was already in the lab. And Dick and I and Ernie, I think, had a natural sort of bonding. I think in part because we all like to pun to incessant nature. So the story I actually tell that only the chemists in the room will probably appreciate is when Dick and Ernie and I went to a symposium at Duke University on development and the nervous system and lipid proteins. And I turned to the two of them and I said, "Do you know what the container they use to keep the membranes they isolate from the early brain?" And they said, "No, what?" I said, "An early myelin flask." So for those of you who are scientists, but that set the stage, because then Dick and Ernie had to modify that, and we were repeating that in different permutations for the next few days. But that set the tone, I think, for the way the lab was. And I don't remember how long it took, but here I was, a fresh young graduate student, and before I knew it, it was Ernie, not Dr. Hodgson. And that was just sort of the way the lab ran. The other thing he did besides saving my career is I think he taught me the importance of independence. When I came in the lab, he said, "I want you to do one experiment for me." He said, "I'll never ask you," I guess he knew I was headstrong. He said, "I'll never ask you to do another experiment. I'll let you make all those decisions. But please do this one for me because I need the data." And I sort of, bitched and moaned for a few minutes, and he said, "Please, just this one time." So I finally said, okay, did the experiment. We ended up getting a paper out of it, and it turned out it shaped my dissertation. It really gave me the ideas that independently I think I cultivated with his help. And so I've had a very good career, and I'm still, by the way, active at my advanced age, and none of this would have been possible without Ernie. So the last two things I have to say are two other of the quotes that I heard from him. One actually came to me, he dumped on me in 1972, early 1972, when he and I think a lot of other people shared worries about the fate of our country with the war in Vietnam raging and an administration, and we later found out hiding things from us. And I decided that I wanted to get active to try and undo the president who I thought was killing our country and killing a lot of my contemporaries. And Ernie actually was behind me 100%. And I actually took off. I used to, like other people in the lab, I used to work long hours. But what I started doing is I would take large blocks of time to try and work for a candidate who did exceptionally well in the polls, named George McGovern. Anyway, and Ernie never said a word, and in fact, he was actually very supportive. I would come in at night to do my experiments and whatever, but Ernie never said a word to me for several months when I was spending a lot of my time doing other kinds of things. Except one time he said to me, he said, "Richard, this is really an important, adventure that you're on, and I think it's important for the country, but just remember, no good deed goes unpunished." So, and then later, I graduated, I did a postdoc, my career started advancing, And, you know, I had dinner with him. I used to come over to Raleigh and have dinner with him occasionally. I came over and had dinner with him after Mary Kay had died. And as we were sitting there talking, he said, you know, Richard, I got to tell you something. You know, you're a very modest man, but then you have much to be modest about. So he was quoting from somebody else, but it rung true to me. So anyway, he was just a tremendous person in my life. We stayed friends for decades afterwards, and I'm sorry that he's gone, but I'll never forget the effect that he had on my life. So thank you. Should I say who's next?
All right, our next speaker is Fred Hain. Fred's a retired emeritus professor in entomology at NC State and has many of the same ties to Ernie that I have.
Thanks, Clyde. I've known Ernie for almost 45 years, and it started when I became a young assistant professor here at State. And as I look back on my career, I realize how fortunate I was to be associated and befriended by some of the true giants in our profession, and Ernie Hodgson was at the top of that list. Now, you've seen his obituary and you've read about his great accomplishments as a scientist. I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about Ernie as a friend. So, I knew Ernie first as a sports fan. He and I shared basketball tickets for many, many years. And I, too, have suffered hearing loss, Clyde. He was also a soccer fan, and I remember one soccer game in particular when I brought my, at that time, very young family to a game, my wife and my two young children, and we met Ernie there and we sat together. And it happened to be a very hot, sunny day, and my wife brought a towel that I held over my two young kids to shade them from the sun. And there happened to be a photographer from the News and Observer there, and they snapped our picture, and the next day it appeared in the paper, and the caption said, "Made in the Shade." And Ernie was in that picture as well. My son, Ernest, we call Ernie. And so to distinguish our Ernie from Ernie Hodgson, our Ernie was Little Ernie, and Ernie Hodgson was Big Ernie. Well, Little Ernie is now 37 years old and 6'2", but to this day, our Ernie was Little Ernie, and Ernie Hodgson was Big Ernie. Ernie Hodgson also loved to go on fishing trips. He and I were probably two of the first guys to go on Wayne Brooks's fishing trips to the coast. I remember those first trips. They were just a few of us that went on those trips. Initially, we went to the Outer Banks, and later we started going to the Core Banks. Now notice I said he loved to go on fishing trips. I did not say he loved to fish. If the fishing was slow, you could usually find Ernie and Ron Coor sitting in their beach chairs, and in fact, one of the photos that was displayed up there showed Ernie in his typical fishing position on a beach chair. And he and Ron Coor would either be chatting with one another, or they'd both be taking a nap. It's still on. If the weather was bad, they would be in the truck. But in deference to Wayne, they would always have a line in the water. The bait on that line was long gone, but they would always have a line in the water. Ernie and I were also part of a monthly poker group. Many of the current members of that poker group are here today. That poker group went on for a long time too, well over 40 years again. And Ernie was notorious for his off-color jokes. Clyde already has mentioned that. And so I can't repeat most of those jokes in this mixed group, but there was one joke that I do remember, and it's probably his best joke, and some of you may remember it too, because he told it at the celebration of his 80th birthday. He told a story about this old man who found a talking frog, and the talking frog said, "If you'll kiss me, I will turn into a beautiful young maiden." The old man took the frog and stuffed it in his pocket and walked on. After a bit, the frog said to the old man, "Maybe you didn't hear me." The old man replied, "I heard you, but at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog." In his later years, Ernie became concerned about driving at night, so I would pick him up to the poker parties. I would take him to the poker parties and take him home as well. On our trips back home, we would usually commiserate with one another over our losses. There was always a bit of a challenge to determine which one of us lost the most. When it came to poker, Ernie and I suffered from the same malady, attention deficit disorder. So with that, I just want to say that I think Ernie was a great scholar, a great scientist, but most importantly, a great friend, and I will miss him.
Thank you, Fred. Our next speaker is Dick Philpott. Dick claims to be Ernie's oldest living former student.
So when I met Ernie, I met Dr. Hodgson, 1967. And I was on a trip around the United States in an effort to make decisions about where I would go to graduate school. One question I raised at each stop was, how are PhD research projects developed in your program? Invariably, some version of, we have several areas we are interested in and we will see which one fits you, or you can pick from the following menu, or I'll give you something appropriate to do. Ernie also responded with something generic, but then added, or if you choose, you can come up with your own project. It was what I was looking for. After my last stop, where I learned from a graduate student, not from the PI, that the primary grant had not been renewed, I called Ernie and signed on. From our earlier conversation, it seemed clear that his interest in students wasn't what he could get out of them to better his program, rather it was what his program could do for the student. After the implication of that, if it is not apparent to you, you were never a graduate student. It was only a few days after arriving on campus in late August that I found out how true that was. When I was informed that I would have to retake 2 entomology courses because mine were deemed unacceptable, in my opinion, at the time, a prime example of academic arrogance, given that I had actually run the laboratory sections of the courses, I gathered up my best "no way this happens" attitude and marched into Ernie's office raving. I'm 27 years old, I have a family, I drove a 32-foot truck across this country, not to have somebody say, "You're acceptable as a graduate student, but your courses aren't worth a damn." And he just looked at me and said, "Why don't you just calm down?" Second step is go to the graduate office and change your major to physiology. I'm on the physiology faculty. Let's not worry about this. So that's what I did, because he said, I should perhaps consider biochemistry and PChem as more productive alternatives to those courses, because indeed what we were after at that time was the role of lipids in Lepidoptera energy production. Certainly not where we ended up. But he was such a master of solving those kinds of problems. This is not a complicated problem. This is a really simple problem. Go change your major. It had not occurred to me to go in and say, I need to change my major. No, it occurred to me to get mad as hell. And he solved that problem. I had found a new mentor, something that I had been very fortunate with from my time in the service at Stanford Research Institute and in undergraduate school. That string ran out when I graduated and found myself in a situation where the primary aim of research was no longer discovering something new. It was career advancement and not necessarily yours. I survived because Ernie had taught me how to be independent and because I managed to keep him as my mentor. We worked on joint projects, shared graduate students, organized symposia, wrote books and research articles, and edited the same journal for over 30 years. I retired and he kept working. He was always the teacher and I was always the student. So here's to Ernie, the best example of gentleman and scholar I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. His contribution to science, his students and staff, the university, and to making the world a better place are many and profound. He will be missed. Thank you.
We're starting to accumulate a pile of programs up here. I think people are leaving. All right, that's fine. So our next speaker is Michael Rowe. Mike is a member of the entomology and plant pathology faculty now, and worked and fished with Ernie for a very long time. You can tell by the hair.
Thanks, Clyde. So Ernie was a great friend of mine for many years, also a colleague. I shared a lot of firsts in my life with Dr. Hodgson. The first lab that I had at NC State was Ernie's first lab over in Gardner Hall. The first grant that I received at NC State was actually a grant that Ernie Hodgson had written, and he gave me the grant. I guess he felt sorry for me. I appreciated that. I said, Ernie, I don't really know how to work with P450s. He said, no problem, and he assigned Pat Levi to teach me how to do the work. So I'm still working with P450s today. We just published a paper with Andrew Wallace on P450, so that's been going on for quite a while. The first NIH grant that I wrote with Ernie's help. The first book that I edited, I'd never edited a book before, co-wrote the book with Ernie Hodgson. So that was a great learning experience for me. And just in, I think, 2015, we published a book together with several other people in this audience, the Dictionary of Toxicology. So that was a great opportunity. There's one thing that Ernie that was very good at. It was mentioned before. He was the first person to teach me the real way to fish, to surf fish, because this was a little bit mentioned before by Fred, but Wayne Brooks and Jack Batchelor, they used to like to run up and down the beach looking for the best place to fish. But Ernie had a much different technique, which I really embraced very quickly when I started fishing with those guys, and it's to sit in a lawn chair at the edge of the water. You can have your line in the water. You don't have to have it in the water. And close your eyes and concentrate on fishing. And then if you hear puffers by Ron Core or Clyde, when they caught a puffer, they would yell, puffers. then Ernie and I would open our eyes and look and decide whether it was time to fish again. So I still use that technique today. It's very effective, I think. So that was a lot of fun. But there's one thing that Ernie never was able to teach me. It was mentioned by many people, and that's that wit. I think it must be genetic. I've tried many times, but with just a little bit of wit, he could put a person in their place just like that. And it's got to be genetic, because I tried my best to emulate that, and I've just been unsuccessful. Let me say a few other things. When I first came to NC State, Ernie and Frank Guthrie and Ron Core and sometimes Dauterman would have lunch once a week at the Golden Key. That restaurant's no longer there anymore, but it's across the street from the campus. And they invited me to those lunches, and as a young faculty member, that them asking me to do that was just a great experience. And we continued those lunches until just before Dr. Hodgson passed away, before he was able to come to work. You would see us almost every week in Sammy's. He taught me how to drink dark beer, and I finally got him to appreciate a wonderful bottle of Not Your Father's root beer. Can you believe he would drink that? He really appreciated that. I was in an entomology faculty meeting, and my wife Janet, I think, texted me that Ernie had passed. And Dr. George Kennedy was sitting next to me at the time, so I mentioned it to George, and I thought George summed up everything very nicely, so I'd like to repeat what George told me. And he only said this. He said, "An era has ended." And that's definitely the case. So I think it was and what a fantastic era. So thanks for letting me speak.
Our next speaker is Rob Smart. Rob Smart's a toxicologist that's worked with Ernie for quite a long time, and a mentee, is that the right word? Mentee? Yeah, mentee of Ernie's. So,
sorry. Ernie hired me as an assistant professor in 1986, and we worked together for 30 years. Even 15 years after he retired, we worked together. And really, he was a great friend, a colleague, and a mentor, and I'll definitely miss him. And he has impacted my life, but many of us here at NC State, and many students, for example. He's trained many PhD students, he's published many papers, and so I thought what I'd like to do is to back up in time and share with you a little bit of the history of the toxicology program at NC State and what Ernie has accomplished. So, Ernie came to NC State in 1961 as an assistant professor. He joined the entomology faculty, and Frank Guthrie, who had been working there since 1954, the year I was born, and Frank and Ernie and Walt Dauterman, among others, worked together to win a very large NIH-NIEHS program project grant that funded research in about 7 different areas. So this is a very large grant. NIH grants at NC State weren't as common as they are now. But it's very interesting to me that Ernie assembled a group of people from entomology, biochemistry, genetics, statistics, and microbiology to be co-investigators on this grant. And today we talk about multidisciplinary research, transdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary research. Ernie was like way ahead of his time. He was bringing people from genetics and microbiology to study the effects of pesticides on target organisms and non-target species, i.e. humans. And so he really broke, really at that point in 1964 when he won that award, he really started the toxicology program at NC State. Interestingly, in 1962, Rachel Karsten published her work, Silent Spring, and there was clearly an environmental health science movement in the country. And at that time, the Congress voted that there should be a division of environmental health science research focused on how environmental exposures affect human health. And this movement continued to the extent that our North Carolina governor in 1965 announced that the National Institute of Environmental Health Science was going to be located in Research Triangle Park. It was the first tenet, major tenet that really dedicated itself to Research Triangle Park. 3 years later, IBM announced that they were moving here. So NIEHS is the National Institutes of Environmental Health Science. It's the only NIH institute that's not located in Bethesda, and it's located here in North Carolina. And after receiving this large program project, Ernie and Frank Guthrie and others wrote a training grant to train PhD students and postdocs, and they won that training grant. That training grant is still active today. I'm the principal investigator on it, and many people, some of the people in this room have been trainees on that grant. Ernie's program project that I mentioned continued for 32 years, so it was reviewed in 5-year cycles. So from 1964 all the way till I believe 94 or 96, that grant was funded. And so that program project and that training grant created the environment to train PhD students to really dedicate something that wasn't at NC State, and that is toxicology. But they didn't stop there. They decided that they wanted to develop a minor in toxicology, so they developed an interdepartmental program in toxicology where students could still get their degree in genetics or physiology, but they get a minor in toxicology, and that was 1970. And then through the 70s then, they were awarded the opportunity to actually award degrees in toxicology. So PhD degrees, Master of Science, Master of Toxicology, now were degrees that were awarded in toxicology. And the first PhD student, Dick, I don't know who that is, and I'd like to know, maybe it's you, the first PhD student in toxicology the first PhD was granted in 1979, so probably it wasn't Dick. I don't know who that is, but so they now have a program in toxicology, they have a training grant, they have a program project grant, they have people working in toxicology across the campus. And then Ernie persuaded the university to allow the toxicology program to move out to Method Road and have its own building. And at that point, this is in the 80s, Ernie was then named the chair of this toxicology program, not director of graduate programs, but chair of this toxicology program, which was operating more or less independently. And there was a building out at Method Road with a lot of greenhouses and such. And from that point, Ernie worked very hard to establish a new department. I don't think there's been many new departments established here at NC State, but Ernie did establish a department in 1989. That was the Department of Toxicology, later renamed the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology. So he now established a department in the 80s, but he wasn't done. He actually worked very hard to convince the university and the legislature to develop a toxicology building on the Centennial campus. And in the year 2000, that dream became a reality. The state legislature approved funds for a 59,000 square foot building on the toxicology building, and many of us work there, many students work there. It's really the heart of toxicology on this campus. Ernie's legacy has been extended, I think, to other large projects. I now am principal investigator of the Center for Human Health and the Environment. It's a large grant that funds a lot of faculty across the campus. I feel like I'm standing on Ernie's shoulders. There's folks in the program that are developing a new proposal aimed at Gen X and these perfluorinated compounds that are in our drinking water and in the river, and the Cape Fear River. So much has happened because of Ernie. I wouldn't be here if Ernie wasn't here. Many of us wouldn't be here. We've trained over 150 students in toxicology. They've gone on to work in government, academia, consulting, industry. But really, Ernie's the guy that put this all together. And we're really going to miss him. But what he accomplished is going to remain, and it will continue to grow. So, thank you.
Our next speaker is Caroline Guthrie, Dr. Guthrie's daughter. There she is.
Hello, everybody. It sure is nice to have such a great big crowd here. I brought a prop. I've actually got a replica of a tobacco hornworm, which is pretty much what got the guys together. And when I say the guys, I mean Walt and Ernie and Frank. I have the dubious honor of being the eldest surviving faculty brat from entomology, unless I did my math wrong, which is entirely possible. So basically what this means is I have a lot of stories about a lot of people, and I'm just going to share a few of them with you. I remember back in the old days when we used to get invited by our fathers to go to work. Now that was very exciting. Beth and I were just commiserating the other day about the poor faculty brats whose fathers were in statistics. I mean, who wants to go to the statistics office? We got to go to Old Gardner Hall, which was an absolute thrill. There were always bugs, there was fruit flies and hornworms and mice, oh my. It was an actual family back then. Everybody got together to do things. The faculty wives even had a little club called themselves the Ladybugs. We have an existing ladybug here today. Liz Axtell is here, so I'm real glad she could make it. I remember how very untechnical it was. You go over to the new building, there's all this technology. I have no idea what half this stuff is. But in our day, it was Petri dishes, Bunsen burners, and microscope, which was pretty old technology for what has now become a completely brand new scientific discipline. You could always find Frank and Ernie, if you listen for the laughter. At that end of the hall is where everybody was going to be gathered and they were just going to be cracking up. Not necessarily doing work, but, you know, exchanging ideas, having fun, driving poor Faye Lloyd crazy. Faye, I admire you so much for what you went through with these guys. They would throw deadlines at her, they would make her do everything. And they're just back there laughing, cutting up, scheming, having a great time. It was not fair, it was not fair, and I apologize. On behalf of Frank, anyway, I apologize. I remember when Ernie got his citizenship, and I was a very small child then, and apparently, when you go and do this, they ask you questions. And they kept asking Ernie, my father went with him, and they kept asking Ernie questions about the Revolutionary War. And when Frank came home, he just thought that was the tackiest thing in the world to pick on poor Ernie just because he was from England. But needless to say, Ernie did pass, and he's here. I keep saying Frank and Ernie like it's one person, like Frankenstein, but that was how they felt to me. It was Frank and Ernie. I mean, they were inseparable friends, they were inseparable colleagues. They balanced their strengths and weaknesses beautifully. And they were able to create what my father would have called, with that horrible Kentucky accent, a powerful force. I swear, between Ernie and his British accent and Frank and that Kentucky accent, I never knew what either one of them were saying. I don't know how his students did it. But they did, and they succeeded. I don't want you to think that it was an easy journey to get from entomology to toxicology. The university did not want this to happen. It was a very long and tough endeavor with both Ernie at the helm and Frank sending the go-to-hell letters to everybody. Poor Ernie. He had to make up every time Frank sent out a letter or talked to somebody. Ernie had to be right behind him, smoothing the feathers, going, no, really, it's a good idea, it's going to work. And Ernie took care of everything. I remember from when Ernie got Tar Heel of the Week, he quoted Frank, and I thought it was funny because he said that Frank was the kind of person who was damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, whereas Ernie was much more deliberate. Ernie was the one that actually got things done. Frank got everybody fired up, but Ernie actually did it. Neither one of them wanted to take credit for anything. They would never take credit alone. If one of them got credit, he was like, oh no, it was Frank. No, oh no, it was Ernie. It was always seen as a team approach. And so that's what we remember, is a whole group of people working together towards a common cause. After my father died, I found some things around the house in the attic and took them over to the new Tox building and asked them to set it up, which they very kindly did. They mockingly refer to it as the shrine, which is not what I meant. What it is, it's a bunch of old textbooks from DHL Library, cutting-edge research for that time, an old Remington typewriter that I know Ernie had one, and I know Frank had one, and a hornworm. Because it all came from very humble beginnings, and I think people should remember that it didn't just happen, that people gave their blood, sweat, and tears for this to happen. I remember when I was young, Ernie and his family were always there for us. We went through a lot of tragedy in our house, and it was good to have Ernie there to count on. He was literally the best friend a family could ever have. Unfortunately, the last time I talked to Dr. Hodgson, he yelled at me. It was just like talking to my father. I caught up with kind of a stupid question, I guess. I had a big old bottle of Dursban. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember Dursban, but it's a long outlawed pesticide. And of course, I've been using it since 1974, since we moved in the house, because it works. Well, it had crystallized. And I didn't really know what to do, so fool that I am, I should have called Dr. Smart. Instead, I called Dr. Hodgson. And needless to say, when Ernie found out that I had a 40-year-old bottle of outlawed insecticide and was actually planning to use it and reconstitute it, he tore me a new one. I could never understand what Ernie was saying. I couldn't understand what Frank was saying. But if they got mad, every single syllable was perfectly clear. And believe me, I knew exactly what Ernie was saying to me. Anyway, fond memory, because he'll always be like a father to me. So, I don't know where they are, but wherever they are, they're laughing, they're cutting up, and they are scheming, and I know that they're together. Thank
you. So our last speaker that's on the program, but hopefully not our last speaker, is Fred Gould. Oh, where'd Fred? There he is. Fred's like me. We're easy to get lost in a crowd. So Fred.
Great. It's great to speak to you. We've heard a lot of wonderful stories, and I'll just tell you one that really influenced my career. You know, it's interesting to hear this. People, each person has a personality, and institutions have personalities. And the institution's personality, of course, is some kind of conglomerate of the personalities of those people who make it up. And I guess I and many of us were so fortunate that Ernie's personality came through in our institution. I've been associated with the entomology department more than toxicology, but it's pervasive. And my story is that I came here in 1977. That's the first time I met Ernie. And in 1977, you know, if we think today about what's going on in politics and the rawness of the debates and so on, in 1977, the rawness of debates in entomology were extreme. There were the faculty members who were interested in biological control and the environment, and then there were the folks who were interested in toxicology and insecticides, and the cultures didn't exactly fit each other. This is after Silent Spring and so on. And I, as a graduate student, was outside of that. I was in an ecology and evolution department, and I was getting my degree and trying to figure out where I would go next. And I wrote a proposal to the National Science Foundation to look at the relationship between insects' ecology and their resistance to being treated with insecticides. So if they had been evolving to deal with toxic plant chemistry, would they also be able to withstand our own chemistry? And I wrote this proposal to them, and they gave me an award to do this study, and basically they told me I could take it any place in the United States to do this work. And at that time my hair way down my back, and I had a big beard, and basically I was a hippie living in a bread truck, you know, so it was sort of like pretty clear that a guy from New York with that credentials would be looking around for a very liberal kind of place to go, and my first choice was Berkeley, California. Berkeley had incredibly good toxicologists and incredibly good people working in insect ecology, and my postdoc required that I bring the two groups together to do this project I wanted to, because I needed to do the molecular work and I also needed to do the work on the ecology. And I thought I had something going with the folks in Berkeley. I was bringing my own money to them, and after a couple of months it became clear that the people in the biological control area and the people in the toxicology area couldn't get along well enough to see somebody come and work together in labs on both sides. And of course this was very disappointing to me, and I started looking around the country for places to go. And there were a few, and I came down to NC State to see if this could be a place where I could work with a toxicologist and somebody in biological control. And clearly Ernie was the great toxicologist here, and there was another faculty member, Bob Rabb, who was working on insect ecology and so on. And I thought, all right, well, let's see what happens. So I came down, and I first interviewed with Bob Rabb, who some of you knew, and you know, he's very slow, southern gentleman. And he drove that slow too when he took me from his lab at Method Road over to see Ernie. And so we finally, you know, we get to Gardner Hall and get out of the car and walk over there. And we walk into this little cubbyhole on the first floor where Ernie is off to the side. And Bob Rabb says to me, Fred, wait a minute, I need to talk to Ernie about something. And okay, you know, I'm sitting on the side there. And it turns out they're trying to figure out how to pass the key between Bob Rabb and Ernest Hodgson so that Ernie could take his family up to a cabin that Bob Rabb owned. And that was it for me. I thought, holy moly, these folks at Berkeley can't even get along, and here's this toxicologist and a biocontrol person sharing a cabin in the mountains. That was it. And that's so I came here, and I've been here for 41 years. And that attitude, that personalities building an institution was so important. And, you know, that whole attitude, you know, as I've been here for so many years, has permeated these institutions of departments. And it's so critical that people who lead that way are the ones who form an institution. And it comes back to there's this old swing song. It goes, you know, it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And that's really what has made entomology and I think toxicology here at NC State. And Mike Gross said, well, you know, George said that's the end of an era. Well, it's the end of one era. I just hope that we can move forward and remember what that legacy is from Ernie and keep living it for him. Thank you.
Before we open it to the floor, Audrey Meyer would like to say a few things. Of course, Audrey's kind of related. Ernie?
I would be daughter number 2 that moved away a couple years after college. But listening to all this, my dad was a great guy, but I also want to share he was a great father. And he touched a lot of lives outside of work also, because he coached mine and Patricia. He started and coached our competitive soccer team. And I got a really nice letter from one of the team members the other day. And that's one thing she really remembered from her childhood. But I do believe it's the first time I've ever seen my father throw the towel in when he drove 16 teenage girls up to Washington State for a tournament. And when he realized we were in the same hotel with the boys' soccer team, he just went to bed.
Okay, is anybody else interested in?
Student, I have to raise my hand. Okay. I'm gonna.
Because I can't figure out how to make
Okay. I'm gonna stall for time while Clyde is working on that. Anyway, I'm another one of the Hodgson daughters, the oldest, and I was too nervous to actually be on the program, but decided I'll live. This is a friendly crowd. But I know everybody here knows that Dad was English, but probably what most of you don't know is that he did not come from the part of England where everyone sips tea at 3 in the afternoon and talks in these lovely posh accents. His father was a coal miner, and he came from the coal fields in the north of England. And that's a far, far, far journey to come here and do the things he did. And I think that's I've heard over and over and over again from people how he helped them out when they were students or when they were in a jam or, all of this. And I think that's part of where that springs from, because he was always very quietly proud of his working class roots. He was always had a soft spot for the underdog, didn't have a lot of respect for authority, really. He was quiet about it, but, he thought things should be done to benefit the people. And that is one of the things that I take with me from him forever. I mean, that's such an important part of him. And, all of you have told all sorts of different stories, and we've seen lots of different aspects of him. And I also wanted to mention a few others, like he was a huge Doctor Who fan. One of the things in the music is the theme song for Doctor Who. And I brought a little audio visual, just like Caroline did. So this, for those of you in the know, is from Doctor Who. It's the Dalek and TARDIS. I am not the big Doctor Who fan. He was. It's the TARDIS. But the most important thing about the TARDIS is that it's much, much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that's kind of how I always think of Dad. Just everything in him. I mean, it was just a huge, expansive spirit that went in so many different places and ways and touched so many different people. So thank you, all of you, for being here. Now I really need to turn it over.
So we have a mic. Anybody else like to say something?
Real quick, before we do that, I just have one more thing to say. I just want to thank all the speakers again, and if we could have a round of applause for them and make some noise for this guy, I would really appreciate it.
My name is Singh. I got my PhD with Dr. Hodgson in 1981. At that time, I was working after my undergraduate degree, and I started taking coursework because the research I was working on, I was not really academically prepared to do what I was doing. And at the time that I worked on my PhD, I didn't realize how accommodating Dr. Hodgson had been. To me, I was quite ambivalent about it because some of the coursework I was taking was really applicable. Some of it seemed extraneous and old-fashioned and really much more of a burden. But I did get my PhD and I moved forward. And one of the things that I'm always reminded of is that long after it's been forgotten what you did, what you said, people will remember how you felt. And this really applies to Dr. Hodgson's impact on me. Because even though I didn't realize it at the time, over the years, as our paths crossed as professionals, based at the International Society for the Study of Xenobiotics, where he had been past president, and I was chair-elect. Later, when I was the founding chair for the Drug Metabolism Discussion Group in RTP, that Dr. Hodgson was there. And as has been reflected here, he made people feel like they belonged, whether they had come in feeling that way or not, that it was really up to us to find a place, and that he would welcome you to find your own place, to feel like an original, to feel that that was not an impediment, that there was opportunity to create your own way, to find your own footing, and where you could, to show leadership. So long after I'd forgotten what Ernie did or said, he left me feeling competent, welcome, and a leader. Thank you, Ernie.
Anyone else?
So even though I'm not a scientist, I actually got to work with Ernie for 10 years and greeted him every morning. And he just put a smile on my face with all of his wit. I loved him to death. He was like a father to me. In the afternoons, he would come in about 3 o'clock and get his chocolates. And we just had the best time. We spent many lunches with him. And just really enjoyed his company. He was a great person to work with. And we really loved him.
Anyone else?
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Randy Rose's wife, and Dr. Hodgson's wife. I moved to North Carolina like you. I remember helping Randy when we lived in Louisiana and he got his PhD at LSU. I remember him helping him type his thesis, and Dr. Ernest Hodgson et al. And that was what he wanted to be, was Dr. Ernest Hodgson et al. He came here, he loved that man. You know, I was watching all the pictures, trying to find pictures of Randy, and I thought, he was probably the one behind the camera. And, you know, that's where he was. I was behind Dr. Hodgson. And I'm grateful for Dr. Hodgson and him bringing us to North Carolina and his mentorship of my husband, who loved him like a father. Thank you.
I recognize an awful lot of folks I haven't seen in a long time. But when you spend 28 years with Dr. Hodgson and those other two gentlemen, it was an experience that I cherish and has influenced my life greatly. I've heard so many remarks from you that were so But one day she came in the office, and with her was a postcard. She had gotten a card from him, probably from Shanghai or Paris or wherever all these cards were, and she couldn't read it. Needless to say, myself and I think it was Karen at the time, we were able to decide if we couldn't have this nice little loan that you would have been able to buy. He was such a delight to be with. He was such a delight. His wit, humor. I was so fortunate to have worked in that program with a lot of the faculty that are here, and I just feel that I was blessed. But I feel like I contributed too, with congregations. And one other thing is I was thinking about it. He was my boss. And you know your program is important in getting there when you have a telephone call, and this is Dr. Tim Johnson from ABC News, medical director in New York. May I speak to Ernest Hodgson? That happened, and I'm going like, oh my goodness. He happened not to be there that day. But a year or so later, when they called, this is the Boston Globe. Could I speak to Dr. Ernest Hodgson? You know you're in an important place. And I was going to say, I had job security because I could read his writing. But then the computer came along, and that opened up a whole other world. And that, I think, is when the books began. Because you've never seen anybody that could type any faster with two fingers, right? He could type faster with those two fingers than most secretaries can that have the keyboard. Needless to say, I was blessed to be able to share 28 years.
Anyone else?
I just want to add something.
Yes.
I think if you were here, he would say that you were his boss.
We actually had that conversation.
Is there anyone else? All right, so I'd just like to add one last little thing before we go ahead and start doing some fellowship. And that thing that he used to say about our best is none too good, that used to chew on me because I got off to my degrees at State. And I'm thinking, that's a shot at me. That's a shot at me. But then I came to realize that really what that was one of his ways of saying how much he loved being here at NC State. Because he was our best. And he certainly was pretty doggone good. And so that's how I think of that statement now. I think he's really saying, I love this place. You might aggravate me. It might frustrate me, but I love this place. And it's really, really good. So, with that, if you will, stand up, stretch your legs, find some food, and you can know each other again. Thank you.
Ain't nothing in the world that I like better than bacon and lettuce and homegrown tomatoes. Up in the morning and out in the garden, get your ripe ones, don't get a hard one. Plant them in the spring, eat them in the summer. All winter without them's a culinary bummer. I forgot all about the sweating and the digging every time I go out and pick me a big one. Homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What would life be without homegrown tomatoes? Only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes. That's for sure, but there's nothing that a homegrown tomato won't cure. Put them in a salad, put them in a stew. You can make your own very own tomato juice. You can eat them with eggs, and eat 'em with gravy. You can eat 'em with beans, pinto or navy. Put 'em on the side, put 'em in the middle. A homegrown tomato on a hot cake griddle. Homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? There's only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes. Change this life I lead, you could call me Johnny Tomato Seed, 'cause I know what this country needs is homegrown tomato in every yard you see. When I die, don't bury me in a box in a cold dark cemetery. Out in the garden would be much better, 'cause I could be a pushing up a homegrown tomatoes. Homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? There's only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes. Homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? There's only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes.
As I was going to Derby, 'twas on a market day, I spied the biggest rancer that ever was fed on hay. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. His ram he had 4 hoofs, sir, and on them he did stand, and every step he took, sir, it covered an acre of land. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. The wool that grew upon him, sir, made 50 packs complete, and that was sent to Flanders to clothe the British fleet. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. The tail was 50 yards, sir, as near as I can tell, and it was sent to Rome, sir, to ring St. Peter's bell. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. This ram he had a head, sir, that reached up to the sky. Eagles built their nets in it, I heard the young ones cry. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. This ram he had 2 horns, sir, that reached up to the moon. A man climbed up in January and didn't come down till June. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. And all the lads of Derby come begging for his eyes, to make them into footballs, for they were football size. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. And if you don't believe me, sir, if you think I lie, just ask the folk of Derby, they'll say the same as I. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as I. And indeed, lads, it's true, lads, I never was known to lie. If you'd have been in Derby, you'd have seen the same as